Good evening to you. My name is Joseph Gerson, and I'm with Massachusetts Peace Action and the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, who together have organized today's webinar about the Ukraine war, what has been passing as diplomacy, and their reverberations through what has become a very complex new Cold War. As we begin, in addition to thanking Professor Sakwa for making time for us, I also want to thank Brian Garvey, MAPA's Executive Director, for anchoring today's Zoom technology. I'll dispense with the usual framing of our webinar. In the aftermath of yesterday's Trump-Putin phone call, everything was about as clear as Mississippi or Niper mud. Trump said that ceasefire negotiations would begin immediately. Putin indicated that no such agreement had been reached. And today we can read in Bezos's Washington Post that in the call, quote, Russian President Vladimir Putin shut down an effort to pressure Russia into an immediate ceasefire and instead opened the way for continued fighting while lengthy negotiations take place. So much for unconditional ceasefire. With Russia apparently not ready to accept a ceasefire while its troops are advancing, if slowly, and much of the EU and Britain committed to continuing their support for Ukraine with weapons and new sanctions, it looks like we might be facing another forever war. In addition to the uncertainties President Trump has added to his assaults on the U.S. and global economies, as well as democracy or constitutional democracy here, we have the question of what Trump's embrace of Putin will mean for Europe. I've been hearing from German friends that Russia's invasion, the ongoing war, and uncertainties over Trump's commitment to NATO are fueling unprecedented European militarism on the continent. Also fueling anti-Russian fervor and compounding existing divisions within the EU. Today, I received a report from a Belarusian refugee about an Estonian-Russian naval and air force incident that could foreshadow future and possibly NATO-Russian conflict in the Baltic Sea. To help us sort this out, we are indeed fortunate to have the opportunity to learn from and interrogate Professor Richard Sakwa. This is not the first time he has made time for us. Just days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, he helped us to understand the history and forces that resulted in the war. Professor Sakwa is of Kent University in Britain and was an associate fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, a senior research fellow at the National Research University, Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and a member of the Academy of Learned Societies for Social Sciences. His books include Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlands, and his more recent, The Culture of the Second World War, Culture of the Second Cold War, which was issued in October. While answering questions a couple of weeks ago in a webinar organized by the Quincy Institute, Professor Sakwa acknowledged that at one time he was placed on a British government enemies list. And then with a grin, he explained that the listing indicated that he was listed there because he knew too much. Before turning our virtual floor over to Professor Sakwa, a few words about format and logistics. After his talk, we will move to Q&A. To pose a question, please use the Q&A box. I assume we're working with this technology. If not, I'll just look for people's hands. We ask that you don't use Q&A space for comments, use the chat box for that. And I'll do my best to see you and to ask you, give you the opportunity for your thoughtful questions, which I trust you will make in brief. Okay, Professor Sakwa, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you again. I'll just get rid of this annoying thing here. Yeah. So, yep. I'm going to talk about 20-30 minutes and hopefully outline some key issues. Certainly very much welcome questions, comments afterwards. Not sure about interrogation, but maybe that's something else. Yeah. So I just wanted to start with outlining the situation on the ground. I mean, how is the war going? And obviously, we're now well into the fourth year of a war, and obviously we're getting the wars becoming as long as the First World War, and clearly it's a obviously catastrophic tragedy. Much discussion about relative losses. We know that over 11,000 Ukrainian civilians have died in the war so far. We also can establish that Russian military losses are about 120,000. This is a study by Mediazona with another respectable bodies. So that would suggest, very, very high losses. We're talking about a major interstate war. Ukrainian losses, of course, Zelensky officially says 44,000, but that's obviously nonsense. Some estimates go, it's well over 500,000. Possibly 700,000. Absolutely catastrophic. Before coming on, for this, I was watching a video which was so disturbing. In fact, it actually shattered my composure. It was basically a video which came out just today, showing Ukrainian citizens being bundled into vans and then, after rudimentary training, being sent to the front. We know that Ukrainian desertions last year were well over 100,000. I mean, I've got some figures here. 77th Brigade and others have lost, a very large proportion of their staff or the personnel to desertion. I mean, it's absolutely catastrophic. But still, the estimates suggest that Ukrainians have about 850,000 men and women on the front line in the armed forces at the moment, plus several, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in various, paramilitary forces behind the front lines. Russia at the moment has about 650,000 forces on the front line. So that is quite clear, and it's growing. So Russia is gaining about 30 to 40,000 people a month. Obviously, there's rotation. Ukrainian forces are not being rotated. Once you're sent to the front, basically, you stay there for months, and some have even been there for years. It's absolutely extraordinary. So Russia's forces are growing, and Russia is pushing ahead all along the front. It's learning, it's changed its tactics. Obviously, we all have heard about the way that drone warfare has developed. And recently, both sides, it's an arms race for drones. Ukrainians producing several million a year, Russia tens, hundreds of thousands, but Russia's, and both sides are making leaps and bounds in technology. Russia's with fiber optic cables means they can't be jammed. They've developed a killer drone which attacks the weaker part of so-called enemy drones, and so on and so forth. One could discuss the military situation for a long time. The basic thing is Russia's pushing ahead all along on all the fronts. And too often Ukrainian forces are deployed for PR purposes, public relations purposes, including just a couple of days ago, an attack again back onto Kursk region, which they'd occupied from the 6th of August last year. And there were mass desertions. In fact, the general who was leading it resigned. He said, look, this is totally pointless. You sent our men into a heavily defended region. Tens, hundreds were shot, were just killed, slaughtered. It's absolutely disastrous. Yet, having said that, morale in Ukrainian forces is still, according to some reports, obviously it's patchy, but it's still holding up. And Ukrainian armed forces are still holding the line. But it's not quite clear how long. So some people are anticipating a German-style collapse as in mid-1918 after its advance, and then a very, very quick collapse. I mean, I'm not sure about that because obviously Ukrainians are defending their own land, and it's clearly there's issues there, and there's a very strong core of very committed soldiers. But of course, Ukrainian society and economy is devastated. It's absolutely, each year, Ukraine this year and next year will be running a $42 billion deficit. The United States is clearly in no mood to provide that money this anymore. I don't think the Europeans have that money, so it's not quite clear what's going to happen. So in short, the military advantage lies with Russia, and that is quite clearly an important point. At the same time, the Russian economy is also holding up. Last year, 3.7% GDP growth. The year before, that's 2023. 2024, 4.3 GDP economic growth. Sanctions have not devastated the economy. I've just come back, well, a couple of weeks ago from Moscow. It's extraordinary. Not only haven't sanctions not devastated, or as Ursula von der Leyen talked, left the economy in tatters. For example, cities like Moscow, not just Moscow, as also in Pskov, and absolutely extraordinary. In Moscow, for example, certainly in the center, all the diesel buses have gone. And they've been replaced by extremely modern, extremely efficient electric buses. So pollution levels way down. And the trams have all been replaced. Soviet-era trams have gone, basically new modern ones. In other words, hundreds of new metro stations, subway stations have been opened. So it's unbelievable. So at a time of war, the Russian economy is developing. Obviously, it's military Keynesianism. Military spending is pumping money into the system, which is causing inflation, which is estimated to reach 10% this year. And of course, interest rates are at 21% as a way to attempt to damp it down. But basically, the sanctions have not achieved any purpose, and they never do. I mean, there's only perhaps a couple of cases in history when they have achieved much. They're certainly damaging. They usually damage the populations and means medicines and other things are not available from the West as they used to be. But ultimately, military Keynesianism has allowed Russia to survive. So that's just a brief overview of the situation. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the US factor, the American factor. We, as I've just talked about the telephone conversation yesterday. The United States has so far provided Ukraine with, I mean, the figures seem to be very dodgy, but according to latest figures, $118 billion. Of that, 69.2 billion were military aid. As we've heard, a number of telephone calls have taken place between Trump and Putin. The last one yesterday for 2 hours. And afterwards, Trump said two things. First, the conversation was good, and that this will push things forwards. But he also insisted that he may have to stop pushing for a deal. In other words, he understands the enormity of the challenge. But he did insist that the two sides, Russia and Ukraine, will have to immediately start negotiating a ceasefire and outlining a memorandum for both sides to outline their positions. I think that's a very sensible thing. That was also the decision, by the way, of the Istanbul meeting last Friday, the second Istanbul meeting, which also said that both sides would go away and outline their positions. So yesterday's discussion was just reinforcing the earlier decision. While I have the opportunity, because it's quite important, I'd just like to say a few words about the Trump phenomenon, how we could explain the phenomenon, because that obviously has a huge effect on how we see the war and how we see the developing international situation, as we used to call it. So I'd say, just to put it in a nutshell, I'm arguing now that the Trump phenomenon represents a threefold defection. He's defecting from three things. Potentially, it hasn't happened yet, but it's on its way, and it's a sort of that's one of the issues involved. The first defection is the United States, under Trump's leadership, is potentially beginning to defect from the Atlantic alliance system that it did so much to create. Some people would call it the rules-based order, the liberal international order, but which is rather different. But he's certainly defecting from the Atlantic alliance system. He signaled that in his first term, and he's been very active, and so has his Vice President J.D. Vance about that. Obviously, that the Munich Security Conference speech a couple of months back still resonates very painfully and loudly in European political circles. So he's thrown this potential defection, which has lasted 80 years basically since the Second World War, with ups and downs. It's thrown European leaders into a massive panic, with endless talk of remilitarization, and even Macron at one moment even said that Europe will have to nuclearize, become an independent nuclear body, and warned that he could share the French nuclear arsenal on a more pan-European basis. I don't think that will happen, but it's a sign of the sheer panic in European political circles. But of course, in this war, the European powers have been the European Union. I'll talk a bit about it later, but it's basically, since the beginning, been pouring gasoline onto a fire. It hasn't really helped negotiations in the slightest. In fact, it's impeding what the United States has been trying to do under Trump in the last few months. So that's the first thing, a potential defection from its own alliance system. Which is rather like Russia defecting from the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. No one expected the center, the imperial center, if you like, to defect from its own empire. The second potential defection is more concerning. So the first one, you could say it's a long delayed. So Trump is asking the right questions, the sort of questions that should have been asked at the end of the first Cold War, brought to an end by Gorbachev in 1989-91. And the question then was, why do we need NATO? Why do we need this US commitment to an Atlantic security system which has done its job? The Soviet Union has gone, the threat is gone. Why perpetuate it? And by perpetuating it, you then perpetuate the Cold War, which it was designed to fight. So he's asking the right questions. Whether he's providing the right answer in this field is another issue. The second defection is potentially from the international system. That is, the Charter International System established in 1945, centered on the United Nations, and on whose basis a whole network of international law, protocols, and in fact norms and legitimacy has developed since 1945. So this whole 80-year epoch since 1945 is in question. We've seen this with Trump talking about cutting the US subvention to the United Nations by 2/3, leaving the World Health Organization, leaving UNESCO, and in fact reviewing all international treaties. This is far more concerning because the United States did so much to establish the United Nations and the wider charter system, and to renege and to defect from that now will have catastrophic global consequences. The world, of course, would then have to establish, with the United Nations, but without the United States at its heart as a major power, it'd clearly be much weaker, just like the League of Nations was in the early interwar years when the United States didn't join. So the third defection, and that deals with the US domestic politics, is a defection from the US constitutional order. And that is from the rule of law, from constitutional stipulations and so on. Well, we can discuss that. Obviously, in the United States, the US history is basically a history of these sort of potential defections. I have in mind the Red Scare of 1919-1920, when over 6,000 people were arrested across 36 cities, mostly Jews and Italians, with left-leaning inclinations. And of course, the McCarthyite persecutions in the late 40s and well into the 50s, which was quite astonishing, destroyed countless thousands of lives and careers. So this is the Trumpian defections, but also Trump is on a very steep learning curve. He is literally a loose cannon. The European leaders, Zelensky, Putin, all trying to point him as a cannon against the potential enemy. So he's swiveling around. And of course, he had until recently 3 big mistakes. He'd been fed information. The first one, that Russia's taking massive casualties. That's why I started with that. Russia is taking casualties, obviously dreadful as it is, but it's not massive. They've changed their tactics. I mean, I could go on a lot about. There's no longer frontal attacks. What they're doing is even using motorbikes, short little platoons, little groups, goes behind the front. They fire off. They've also been taking the islands in the lower Dnieper River across from Kherson, which assumes that they could be planning to cross the river again. He also Trump believed that the war was inspired by Putin's personal animus, that it was some sort of personal hang-up, his own fantasies and resentments, which is, of course, the right-wing usual understanding that Putin woke up one morning full of resentment and decided to invade. Well, in fact, of course, as we know, and as we had in our earlier discussion, the root causes of the war goes back 30 years, the failure to establish an inclusive and equitable European peace order at the end of the Cold War, which I've described in my latest book, by the way, called The Lost Peace, well, penultimate book, The Lost Peace, how we squandered and the potential for a positive peace order at the end of the First Cold War. And so the third mistake, which Trump had, was the belief that Russia's economy was collapsing and that the Russian leadership elite was looking for a quick exit, or indeed that Putin's own position was under threat by people, hostile people alienated by the costs of the war. In fact, that's completely mistaken. Even the New York Times a couple of days ago described interviews, which was interesting, with 11 Russian soldiers. All of them said, with grim determination, that they're going to see this war to an end. That what have all the sacrifices been for if they don't achieve the goals, which I'll talk about in a minute. But ultimately, they have to achieve it. So there's not going to be a quick pullout at the moment. So that then takes us to the negotiations. As we mentioned, the negotiations were held in Istanbul just last Friday, and in a discussion. And of course, an immediate effect was a prisoner swap, 1,000 from each side. Ukraine wanted all for all, but Russia's got far, far more Ukrainian prisoners of war than Ukraine has Russians. So clearly that was going to be imbalanced. But the second decision was a written version of the peace conditions, the thing which was also discussed yesterday in the Putin-Trump telephone call, and preparations for possible Putin-Zelensky meeting. So that was from Istanbul too. And of course, the European Union and Ukraine argued that talks should only happen after a ceasefire is in place. Now, I'll repeat this because that is an absolutely nonsensical position. Why on earth should Russia agree to a ceasefire along the line of contact, the Kellogg plan, Keith Kellogg, because that would, and Kellogg is talking about a 15-kilometer withdrawal of forces on either side, which would allow Ukraine to rebuild its forces. Europeans, maybe not the United States, but the United States probably also, would then pump in weapons, and Russia would lose everything it has achieved in this war. So that's obviously a non-starter. And so, a ceasefire usually comes after some discussion, or you have discussions and a ceasefire in parallel, but not the absolute maximalist sequencing which Zelensky and the European powers want. A unilateral 30-day ceasefire, which would allow the Europeans to pump in weapons. I mean, it just simply, and even possibly forces, their own forces as a tripwire, and so on. So Russia has politely declined that. But still, I welcome very much all these negotiations. Finally, in the fourth year of war, we're having talks, and that is exceptionally positive to outline the things, because Istanbul 1 nearly got a peace deal. As you remember, discussions started in Gomel in Belarus just 4 days after the start of the war, on the 22nd of February 2022, and by mid-April, the 15th of April, following the Istanbul communique a few weeks earlier, they had a deal. And it was all ready to be basically signed. There was a few issues to be solved, but as we know, ultimately Biden's team, Biden, Blinken, but above all Sullivan, who is the real architect of this war, really is. He's the man ultimately who drove this war from the beginning. They were absolutely refusing to accept it. So it was and of course it was scuppered by Biden's team and Boris Johnson's visit on the 9th of April that year. So that was so what are the terms? So it's quite clear. What does and Russia said this at the Istanbul talks. What is Russia demanding? And ultimately, these demands are mostly non-negotiable. A neutral Ukraine. In other words, it will not join NATO, but also no foreign troops or weapons of mass destruction on Ukrainian soil. No reparations, mutual waiver of any claims for compensation. And also the cultural side, the rights of Russian speakers. Ukraine must adopt European standards regarding the rights of minorities and put an end to this so-called nationalist propaganda. And obviously also a recognition of territories. So far, Crimea is one thing, but also the four others. And Medinsky, who was the head of the Russian delegation in Istanbul, was then quoted as saying that Russia will have ambitions to have 5 regions. And he says, no, I was misquoted. We're talking about 8, not just the 4 at the moment, apart from Crimea. That is Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, but also possibly Sumy, Kharkov, Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, who knows? So Nikolaev, of course. So this is the sort of on Russia also maximalist arguments as well, and the condition of an immediate ceasefire, that the Ukrainian troops would have to move out from the entirety of the 4 Ukrainian regions, though Russia occupies almost all of Lugansk, most of 80% of Donetsk, and about half of Zaporozhye and Kherson, well, more than half of Kherson. So to move, so in other words, the positions are really almost irreconcilable. Clearly that Russia has these demands, and it's it's not quite clear if there's a medium point. So let us, in my final bit, well, penultimate bit, just to look, what is the big picture? What is the big picture at the moment? So the big picture is clearly we'll be discussing this war for generations to come. But one of the astonishing things that I think that will emerge is why Ukraine was willing to sacrifice itself on the cruel altar of geopolitics, why it was willing to sacrifice itself to join a military bloc, that is NATO, which was designed to prevent the need for a country to sacrifice itself for geopolitical purposes. So it simply doesn't make sense unless you begin to understand that the Ukrainian elite, which came to power in the so-called Revolution of Dignity in 2014 in the Maidan, was so classically involved believing in the ideology of Europeanism, the ideology of Westernism, that this was the key to development, the key to modernity, the key to prosperity, the key to putting an end to corruption and to opening up the good life. Well, of course, there's plenty of those elements probably factual and correct, but still, it was an ideology. And when you have an ideology, and of course, it was propounded in particular, combined with the Ukrainian middle class, combined with the nationalists from Galicia, Western Ukraine, established a very, very potent combination, encouraged by Washington and London from the very beginning, in these illusions that somehow or other Ukraine could achieve all of this while fostering an enmity and becoming a perceived threat to Russia. So that was the first point. It's just a puzzle, and I've given some reasons which may explain it. Obviously, in there, when the history books are written, Zelensky will be perhaps admired for his courage in the early stages of the war, but he's been a catastrophic war leader. At every point, it has been public relations rather than military strategy which has dominated. He's a brilliant showman, as that Simon Schuster book calls him, the showman, but he's a dreadful politician and statesman. A statesman, the job of a statesperson is to defend and protect the sovereignty and integrity and prosperity of your own nation. And in fact, at every point, Zelensky has squandered it. So that's the first point. As I say, Ukraine was not likely to join NATO anytime soon, but under Zelensky in particular, but also Poroshenko, he NATO was in Ukraine, and it was ever more so. For example, in November 2021 US Charter on Strategic Partnership. So, and a third big point is that if the Ukrainians and the Western backers go down to defeat, what will be the political outcome? Certainly, NATO's credibility will be shot, which, of course, really is weakened by, as Trump is no fan of NATO, quite probably wisely, and it will discredit itself. Also, a fourth point, the global South regards this war with unfeigned and contempt. Yet again, this is perceived to be the global North, simply, and Europe, of course, simply cannot stop fighting. And the argument then comes: for 500 years of Western civilization has been genocidal. Just ask the Aztecs and the Incas and so many peoples in the Caribbean and elsewhere, and in Africa and in Asia. And you could say that ultimately what we're seeing is unraveling not just of the political West, not just of this Atlantic power system of the last 80 years, but the unraveling of a whole Western culture and civilization, which is now challenged. I leave aside the whole Palestine-Gaza question, of course, which exacerbates all of that as well. And we see the counter-hegemonic alignments in the world majority or global South really driving forwards, not just in organizational terms, but in normative terms, in defense of the Charter United Nations system, in defense of international law, in defense of just common decency in international politics. And of course, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I've been reading a lot about the ASEAN Plus meeting. Malaysia is the chair in office this year, and they've invited Putin, and they're exceptionally active. And just a word on ASEAN, there is a genuine ASEAN spirit, which is a belief in cooperation in international politics, which is exceptionally important. It's an alternative model of world order to our exhausted Western aggression and colonialism and imperialism, as they would see it. The only winner, of course, is China. I mean, I could talk a lot about how they're transforming Africa and so on. And my final big point is the European Union, and because I don't have time, I won't go into it, but happy to talk about it in the Q&A. The European Union has turned from a peace project to a war project. The enormity of this transformation is only just beginning to sink in. It is becoming a geopolitical player without the instrument of geopolitics.
I'm having a sound problem.
Okay. Okay, I was going to leave. So I'll just then I've just come to my final comment. Can you hear? Is this okay?
It's good now, yeah.
Okay.
You're fine.
So so just finally, because then the title of this talk was Peace Movements, and of course it's fantastic to have such a group. And in fact, also on Thursday, I'm speaking on similar issues to the British Stop the War coalition. So there are peace movements, of course, as I think we discussed and when we've earlier met, just how much weaker they are than they were in the 60s, 70s, 80s against the deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles, the European Euro missiles crisis. But the bottom line is, and this is something quite building on what I just said, the West has forgotten how to make peace. And this is a frightening conclusion. And it has taken a Trump to remind the world that peace is, it has taken a Trump, I mean, a flawed vessel if there ever was one, but it has taken Trump to remind the world that peace is important. And he is fighting, I mean, you're obviously closer to Washington than I am, but it's quite clear that he's faced down the neocons, those who wanted to bomb Iran, those who wanted, as you know, there was a plan for a full-scale offensive against Ansarullah in Yemen. There was a bombing already a bit, which then he called it off. But the West, European Union, Britain, has forgotten how to make peace, and it has taken a Trump to remind us that peace is ultimately the supreme value. And of course, he's doing it not because he loves peace as much, but for him, his worldview is a transactional one, it's a cost benefit one. And that's not a bad view. Of course, it's got a negative side to it, but at least he's opened up the door to a peace process. And so, on that basis, I certainly welcome it. So I'll stop there and happy to have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Sakwa. It was quite a tour de force. Before we move to Q&A, I think Brian is going to put a notice in the chat. This webinar was initiated out of a discussion in Mass Peace Action's Ukraine Working Group, and we will be happy to have more people join that working group and help us work for a just peace and an end to the catastrophic war. So look to the chat with the notice there from Brian Garvey of Mass Peace Action. I will do my best to try to see everybody's questions. If you want to raise your hand, best if you use the raise hand function, which you'll find if you hit the react heart at the bottom of your screen. I guess I would like to start though with a question along the lines of what Professor Sakwa was closing at the end. You know, in your book, The Culture of the New Cold War, you talk about the missionary dimensions of liberal democracy in Europe, and ultimately it's belligerent and, as you've said, genocidal dimensions. How do you see that playing out in the next period? And is with Trump's effort to make deal with Russia and the economic disasters that Trump is bringing on, especially for Europe, are we going to see a very sharp decline in Europe, its marginalization, which in turn could lead to fascism? What are we facing?
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's I'm really glad you've raised that question, because a lot of us are talking now about the suicide of Europe. We're talking about, there's commentators in Germany in particular, Wolfgang Munchau, Wolfgang Streeck, and so many more, who are analyzing the fact that Europe is clearly, it was a subaltern force, but as long as it was part of this dynamic Atlantic economic and power system, it was able to survive. But it's clearly losing out now in all respects. In particular, for example, the cutting off the energy relationship with Russia is leading to the deindustrialization of Germany. The Draghi report of the end of last year showed just how uncompetitive Europe is. Even in United Kingdom, we have, we've got more AI and equivalent high-tech startups than France and Germany and Italy and several other countries combined, because of the drag of bureaucracy and regulation in the European Union. And above all, the European Union has lost, you could say, it's lost its soul. Under Ursula von der Leyen, we've seen a power grab. We've seen the appointment of a whole stack of East Europeans, or the East Europeanization of the European Union, which has turned it into an instrument for the perpetuation of Cold War, an instrument for the perpetuation of those East European post-communist resentments against a former imperial master, Moscow. And it's a suicidal ambition. We have Radek Sikorski in Poland, the Baltic leaders, Kaja Kallas as the European Union Foreign Affairs Commissar. These people are, how can I put it? It's they're ideologues to the point of madness. And so I'm deeply pessimistic about the future of Europe. As for the United Kingdom, we've had our Brexit. But as we can see, in the last local government elections, the Reform Party, which is a populist right-wing anti-immigrant party, gained, for example, in my county, I live in the county of Kent, and we've just had a local government elections in May this year. And in the election, unbelievably, which has been dominated by the Conservative Party for generations, the Reform Party won 57 out of 82 seats. They're now in the driving seat in Kent County Council. I mean, this is an electoral, and they won in 10 counties. There are 10 county councils, and of course, hundreds of councillors elsewhere. So this is an electoral, how can I put it, earthquake. And and it shows a volatility of voters. We saw the German elections just recently, where AfD becomes the second largest party, overcoming above even the Social Democrats. So yeah, so the future in all respects, but above all, it's losing the soul. It's lost its intellectual direction, and it's become, as I say, it's moved from a welfare state to a warfare state, and so this is going to end very, very badly.
Thank you. It's a grim outlook, but I'm afraid it's right on. I see four hands initially here, and let me just ask that you keep your questions brief, so we can have many of them and we don't monopolize the discussion. So I see Gray Southen, number one, Paul Shannon, number two, Michael Longerin, number three, and Norma Harrison, number four. Great, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm from New Zealand, and I'm very impressed with your analysis. It's really, really striking. Um, I, I'm astounded at the failure of the peace movement and the decline in the peace movement that you outline. And I've been wondering whether that one of the reasons for that is that there's been inadequate appreciation of the dominant belief that security comes from military power. It's a rational belief in many respects, looking at our history. But in the sociology of fear, I think it falls apart very rapidly. But
Gray,
nevertheless, that is
could you kind of come quickly to your question?
yeah. Is the reason for the weakness of the peace movement is it has uh, failed to come to terms with this dominant belief that security comes from military power.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. I very much like that question because it's a core of what we're talking about. And I would put that in a historical context. At the end of the Second World War, the powers came together in 1945 to establish the United Nations. And it's, nations isn't just the organization, it's all the ideas and ideology associated with it and the principles outlined in the Charter of the United Nations and a Charter international system. And that was outlining an alternative ideology or an alternative program or to what you've just said, that it said, no, security does not come from military power. It comes from nations working together. And that is why the Charter bans war as an instrument of politics against Clausewitz, etc. And that is what I'd say any peace movement has to go back and constantly stress the United Nations, the Charter itself. It doesn't have to join the United Nations Association, but it has to go to say, no, it's diplomacy and dialogue, which is the genuine source of security. And of course, security then needs to be embedded in a peace and development project. And that is why I'm so impressed by the spirit of ASEAN, those 10 ASEAN countries, as you know. Some are communist, Vietnam, Laos, some are capitalist, Malaysia, etc. Some are big, some are small. Indonesia is big, Singapore is small. Yet they all work phenomenally together and quite explicitly. Last year, I was lucky enough to talk to one of the leading figures, because Laos was the chair in office last year. It's Malaysia this year. And this Laotian really had magnificent, who was answering your question before you posed it, if you see what I mean. And they were outlining exactly this alternative logic. And this security comes from military power is the ideology of this Atlantic power system, this political West, which for 80 years has been undermining the charter system, which again it did so much to create. So it's this Atlanticism, and then there's American political science believing, that the Roosevelt thing, talk quietly but with a big stick. Yeah, but we have to work to a point in which that big stick is no longer required, and as they're doing it, and as I will stress, just my final point. Sorry to go on for so long, but just to say that. They really do, talking to Laotians and Malaysians now in office, and indeed the revived non-aligned movement. And I've just come back not long ago from Indonesia. The way is so the contempt with which the global north, and I'm sorry, you're from New Zealand, but we can include you if you don't mind in this condemnation. But the way the global north, what's the matter with you? They keep asking me, what's the matter with you guys? Why do you have to every generation start a war? First World War, Second World War, 54 interventions in the First Cold War, US, and so on. It just never stops, invading Iraq, Libya, bombing Serbia. I mean, when will you stop? And this is where the peace movement and this discussions like this are so important.
Thank you, Richard. That's refreshing, and it's sort of a reminder of how parochial we have become here in the United States. Paul Shannon, you're next.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your presentation. I'd like to ask you a question. What happens in the negotiations or in the talks between Russia and between Putin and Trump if Russia sticks to its position on ceasefire, which is no ceasefire until there's some type of settlement, as I understand it?
Yeah, the root causes.
And what happens if they stick to that, which I believe they will, and refuse to go along with Trump's peace agreements, or whatever you want to call them? They seem to change a lot. But anyway, what happens? Are we looking toward Trump abandoning his desire to get out of Ukraine? Are we looking at Trump then stepping up sanctions, continuing military support for Ukraine? How does that play out over the upcoming 6 months?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. It's a crucial question. Usually we say that there is no military solution, but clearly, both sides believe there is a military solution. Obviously, Zelensky and his European backers believe there's a military solution. That's why they are pumping in the weapons and maintaining their maximalist position, that there can be no negotiation over territory, over NATO, and all that, all the rest. Whereas Russia is also sticking to its position. So what happens is, the fighting continues. Russia, by the way, I mentioned, it has this huge reserve army, and so there's much talk of a potential, which actually may have begun, a spring and summer offensive. So, military side, we need to take that into account. Second, I would just like to commend Trump for his attempts to start a negotiation peace process. And therefore, I'd also, by the same token, condemn whatever you say about Biden, and obviously sympathy for him personally today. But condemn Biden because for 50 years, he's been wrong on every major issue, as so many people say. And he is responsible for this war, and appointing people like Sullivan. Blinken was completely out of it, but Sullivan, who was a real eminence grise in all of this. So the United States, so it's peculiar. The United States did so much to provoke this war, and now we have a leader of the United States who's positioning himself as a mediator. And Trump himself, of course, was the one who in 2017 started sending javelins and so on to Ukraine, which also then set the dynamic. So he says it's Biden's war, but it's also Trump's war. So that's the second thing. But still, I respect his attempt to come to an end now. The third thing is, you say, sanctions. As you know, Lindsey Graham is talking, and he's got a draft law, I think, in Congress, which is extraordinary, punitive, 500% tariffs on any country which trades with Russia. If that goes forwards, and so there's two options. One, the United States walks away, which is the good option. I mean, the least bad option, put it this way, if things don't go on. So it doesn't keep, sorry, pumping in the weapons, doesn't provide intelligence for long distance strikes on Russia and so on, which basically kills civilians. But so if they walk away, if they do go for the sanctions, then we are yet, this escalation ladder to the Third World War. And so I'm deeply pessimistic. The war will continue and it could well escalate because despite Trump's efforts, he hasn't reined in the neocons enough in Washington. He hasn't spoken firmly enough to Zelensky. He's got to say to Zelensky, accept these terms or take the consequences. He won't say that. But when I say with Trump, you can never say never. Yeah. So, but thank you for the question. It's, in other words, there's so many moving parts, but clearly at the moment, one of the key thing to look at is the front lines at the moment and the tide of battle.
Thank you. Grim times. Michael Longren.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Thank you, Professor Sakwa, for this presentation. Do you think that Zelensky or his administration can survive a negotiated peace? And if not, can you speculate on what might take the place of the Zelensky administration?
Thanks so much for that. That's a very important point indeed. Because as you know, Zelensky was elected in April 2019 as the peace candidate. He won 73% of the vote. But then within months, he capitulated to the hardline nationalists, the so-called anti-capitulationist front. He refused then to implement the Minsk Accords, which could have averted the war quite easily by giving a degree of devolution to the Donbass, the sort of devolution that we have in the United Kingdom to Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. There's nothing unusual about it, and yet those people refused to accept it. And it's the responsibility of the European Union and Angela Merkel personally for not having pushed this. Angela Merkel, quite apart from the United States not having pushed it, but certainly the European powers, which were France and Germany as the guarantors. So if there was a peace, then of course Zelensky was captured or capitulated to the anti-capitulationists. So whatever peace deal emerges will threaten Zelensky's position. You're absolutely right. So it's, by the way, there is a lot of talk that his position even now is under major threat. There's a lot of, Syrsky is the head of the Ukrainian military, and endless talk of his replacement at the moment for somebody, because the military are not happy at the moment. That's for sure. So, and will the United States do a DM in 1963 in Vietnam, which is a lot of talk about that. Initially, that seems to have gone away because Zelensky is a brilliant PR merchant. He really is. And, basically, he's popping up everywhere. If he's not in the Vatican one day, he's in Washington the next, or Saudi Arabia, or Ankara, Istanbul. I mean, heaven knows where he is. He's everywhere except governing and saving his own people in Kyiv. So, I mean, he will go down in history as probably one of the worst leaders humanity has ever seen, because he's allowed his country to be dragged into a war which was so easily avoidable. His position is under threat. But at the moment, the United States, Trump, doesn't look as if they're pushing for early elections, which was the talk a couple of months ago, to do a type of DM replaced by two sort of business. So, yeah, but you're absolutely right. And the domestic situation in Ukraine is an important factor in any negotiations, because how will it be accepted? How will it be sold to the public? And so, in other words, there has to be some concessions to any Ukrainian leader so that they can go to the people with certain dignity and honor. Otherwise, the peace won't hold. So Ukraine has to emerge, perhaps demilitarized, but yet with a compensation. And Russia has actually opened the door to the use of its $300 billion, which have been sequestered at the moment in Euroclear in Brussels. It's actually said, as long as they said that is used for the rebuilding, not just of of all of Ukraine, including that part which is under Russian, under Russian rule at the moment. So thank you.
Thank you. For those of us who are older, it brings to mind 1963 and the shock of Diem's assassination, which was followed not long thereafter by Kennedy's. I've got Norma Harrison, followed by C.T. Weber and Valentin. Val, I apologize for not pronouncing your last name properly. So we're to Norma first.
Hello, everybody. Hope you had a chance to look at what I posted in the chat. One of the things being an evidence of the misuse of the good ideas. The people at the UN that have not got power and not got ability to control the results of what goes on there have been benefiting from meeting each other, regardless that they have not got the construction of the power that which a couple of the postings allude to. And it's been a great benefit. The result of these events today will be what you can see in Africa. It is going
Norma,
to
can you
become
come Norma, can you come to a question?
Can I come to a statement?
A question, not a statement.
I'm asking you if I can come to a statement. I was in the middle of a statement.
No, we're not doing statements here. We're doing Q&A.
But I don't have any questions. I know everything, and I'm communicating it with a large group of people, and I'm hoping that people can at least try and pick up on the ideas.
Okay, Brian, can you move on? Her posts
Yeah,
are there
but
for
can I
everybody
just
to read.
respond to Norma, just to say the comment about the United Nations? I agree with you. It is a flawed organization, yet it's the best we've got. And I think we've really got to defend it. So, as you say, so much work takes place, not just in the Security Council, but in the General Assembly, the corridors, the commissions, the 24 odd specialized agencies, and so much. So it's a deeply flawed organization. But, but we've really, obviously there's talk of India and African countries joining the European Security Council. But at the moment, we just got to make it work. And more than that, we've got to really establish it at the center of international politics, which, of course, the so-called rules-based order, the US-led system, and of course, Trump in particular, have always, ignored it. And, well, all major powers do, of course. But yeah, I mean, we could talk about the United Nations for a long time, but I'm glad we're putting it back at the center of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. C.T. Weber, please.
Okay. I'm really interested in this conversation. It's really a refreshing approach, but I do want to, my wife is from the Soviet Union and she's in communication on a weekly basis with her family there. And
whereabouts in the former Soviet Union?
Leningrad, or now
Okay.
St. Petersburg.
Yeah.
And so there is some recession going on. People are having a harder time as far as buying. Also, she listens to the various talk shows and programs over there, and there is a sort of a resistance to some of Putin's approaches. Some people thinking actually that they should be actually going to war, not just playing around. But anyway, I just want to get your comments on the inflation that's going on there and lack of buying power.
Yeah, you're quite right. There are two things there. There is inflation, as I said, 10%, and for some foodstuffs, way above 10%. So the cost of living has gone up quite significantly. Of course, Russia's become a much more equal society since the war because the military payments are so huge. And of course, it spread it to many of the depressed regions. As I say, I've just come from Pskov. And you could see, there's a certain amount of money going there, which wasn't there before. But you're absolutely right. It's, if this war goes on, it has huge societal strains. But that's one thing. But I was going to say, yeah, but I'd like to pick you up on your second point. And that is the talk shows and so on are indeed, and this is something, referring to the earlier question about Zelensky. Putin also has his domestic constituency. Yes, he enjoys between 75 and 80% public support now, still in this time of war. So any idea of any discontent, obviously people are not happy, but he still enjoys support. But the military bloggers and so on are arguing that Putin is far too soft, unlike the Western image of him as the devil incarnate. In actual fact, I'm so glad you mentioned this, in his domestic context, there are so many people, and I meet them just in the taxis and so on, who says, look, Putin is he in the pay of Washington or what? Why isn't he actually fighting this war like a war? Why are we fighting it with one hand tied behind our back? Why don't we unleash the full power of our weapons? So you're absolutely right. So Russia also has to, if Putin gave away too many concessions for today, those 4 oblasts, the 4 which I've mentioned, if he gives them away or something like this, then he wouldn't last. There'd be a revolt. So both sides are constrained by their domestic constituencies. So thanks for pointing that out.
Thank you. Good. Val, again, I'm sorry for for your last name. Why don't you give us your last name and then we'll jump in.
Okay, it's Moghadam. It's an Iranian last name. You can pronounce it, Joseph, as Moghadam if you like.
Okay, I'm
Perfectly
sorry.
fine. No problem. Thank you, Professor Sakwa, for that, excellent, analysis. The U.S., as you're aware, the U.S. approach to the UN has always been somewhat, ambivalent. If we can't dominate them, we will withdraw from the UN and its entities. And the U.S. has done that several times, at least since the late 70s, 80s, when it was very angry about the new international economic order and so on.
Oh, yeah.
But the question that I have for you, when you were talking about how strong Russia remains, that's really interesting to me, because when the war started, I was under the impression that the US, and this time joined by Europe, were creating a trap for Russia in the same way that Reagan had created a trap for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan back in the 1980s, which, helped the collapse of the USSR. And yet the opposite has happened. You're saying that, Russia has managed to withstand the slings and arrows of misfortunes and so on, and is doing rather well. What do you think explains the difference? Why is Russia doing so much better than the USSR did in the 1980s? Thank you.
Yeah. And in fact, thank you for referring to that earlier incident. The strategy was devised by Zbigniew Brzezinski in the late Carter years, 1979, in mid-1979. And then, of course, and he explicitly said it in later interviews to suck them in December 1979. And then they had Babrak Kamal after the death of Amin. So you're absolutely right. And this was quite explicit. So you're absolutely right that this was in the back of the mind of anybody. Well, I'm sure of Jake Sullivan. As I say, he's the real evil genius behind this all, and he is the Zbigniew Brzezinski of our days, though with only a quarter of the intellectual capacity. But you're absolutely right. And in a sense, yes, this war, one of the major narratives of it is that it was designed, and Lloyd Austin, the former defense minister, made it quite explicit. And some of the European states made it explicit. Let us weaken Russia today so that then we can target our forces against China tomorrow. So obviously, Beijing are not stupid. So they understand we need to support Moscow today so that they don't come after us tomorrow. So that is one thing which is helping Russia, is that that China is probably sending far more dual-use stuff, far more, because they know once they're finished with this one. The United States simply has war in its genes, of course. It's $1 trillion military budget coming up for next year. So, you know, they're going to support it. India, of course, takes advantage of it economically. So, plus, of course, people underestimate the enormous transformation of the Russian economy. It's actually a working capitalist economy, market economy, and it's got huge centers. Russia never deindustrialized. Yes, it suffered a lot in the 1990s and so on. And yet, you know, it's still got Russia is a full service economy. It's pumping out 152 millimeter shells. In the West, of course, they're 155 millimeters, NATO standard, but 152 millimeter shells by the million. Whereas the European Union was talking about a million, but it, you know, several 100,000 is a maximum at the moment. And the United States doesn't have the capacity at all. And so it's astonishing. Where's all those trillions and billions gone for the US defense budget is what we constantly ask. Where is your bang for your buck? And you've got the F-35s, which barely works, which by the sound of it, one was shot down or nearly shot down over Yemen just a few days ago. So in other words, Russia, you should, you know, Bismarck said this, or allegedly said it, Russia is never as strong as it thinks it is, and it's never as weak as we think it is. So that's it, part explains it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, pal. Susan Mirsky, you're up. Susan?
Yeah. Okay. My question, here at present, we see so much support for Ukraine as an anti-Trump message. So these are Democrats who, of course, supported weapons to Ukraine because it was the Democratic, you know, on the Democratic message. But now it seems like it is anti-Trump. If Trump can walk away from the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, are there any entities, any countries that would take up a serious negotiation between the two of them? And then aside from that question, there is what I hear standing on the streets, that Russia will take over Zaporizhia and the problems with that. So what do you know about that?
Yeah. It's thanks for that. It's fascinating to see how the Democratic Party has turned into a war party. James Carden made this, of the Quincy Institute, made this argument, but it certainly does seem to be the case, is that the Democrats are fully invested, and in fact, unfortunately, since the Clinton years and Clinton's catastrophic leadership in enlarging NATO, when he knew, everybody warned him that the consequences would be disastrous, above all for Ukraine and indeed Georgia. And it is the Democrats which have taken the lead on this. And then, of course, it was the Democrats who whipped up this the Russiagate scandal, which, you know, of alleged collusion between Trump and Putin in 2016, 2017, which, of course, we now know to have been indeed a hoax. So it's you're absolutely right. The way that politics has inverted, and there's a larger issue. Why is most of the left also now invested in war and conflict, and instead of doing what we're doing, trying to establish a peace agenda? And that is quite astonishing in all sorts of ways. Who could step in if the United States doesn't, decides to let them fight it out? China, Brazil, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, India, and BRICS countries. There's a very long list of countries who will do it. Already China brokered a type of peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia a year ago, which I thought was absolutely amazing. Don't forget, they're both now members of the BRICS alignment. So if the United States does walk away, it's a question, will it just walk away, or will it continue sending in money, arms, and intelligence and weapons and so on? So, will it? One person which I didn't mention, of course, is the European Union. Will they step it? And that just shows the European Union is marginalized and, of course, thoroughly discredited. And I don't just say that because I live in Brexit land, but it's, it really is, I've been a committed European all my life, but not this Europe, a functionalist one for the people and so on, not this one. So it's catastrophic. I mean, we say it's all across the global north, it's catastrophic. Yet elsewhere, I mean, patchy as well, but Spain is doing okay. But it's but the European Union and European leaders, those four, Donald Tusk from Poland, Macron, Merz, and Starmer, the Gang of Four, let's call them that, the party not of the coalition not of the willing, but the coalition of the killing. They will go down in infamy in history, in my view. So thank you for that.
So just to comment here, I think one of the challenges for those of us who are committed to real peace and justice here in the United States is that the political landscape has really changed and raises some moral questions. I was at a conference at Brown University 10 days ago focused on China. It brought together a really quite remarkable spectrum of people from the left to the hard right. They all want to avoid a war with China. And at the same time, those on the right are happy to celebrate, the Gestapo tactics on our streets. And this makes politics here in the United States that much more interesting, to say the least. I don't know that I'm raising that as a question, but simply to reflect back on that. I'm seeing one more question. If you have a question, put it in now because our time is getting late. Mary Sifferlin is next up and maybe last. Mary, you there?
Hi, yeah. Hi, I had a question. Trump said he would not support Ukraine being in NATO. So why isn't that sufficient for Putin to stop killing Ukrainians?
Yeah, because Zelensky and the European leaders have not only rejected Trump's statement, which was, I thought, excellent. You're absolutely right. Thank you for pointing it out. They've not only rejected it and said it's a non-starter. So they're committed. And Zelensky says, we will join NATO. The Gang of Four insist that they will join NATO. So, and don't forget, Russia, all the way back from Gorbachev, feels that it was betrayed in 1990 when James Baker and others at the time of those discussions at the time of German unification, 30 leaders said that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. And look what happened. So, and then of course you got the Minsk deal, which was a reasonable way of solving the devolution. And don't forget the Donbass, through the Minsk deal, would have remained part of Ukraine, which I'd have wanted, but with linguistic and cultural autonomy. What's wrong with that? So, but they refused it, and so
but if one member of NATO refuses, then no one can join.
Yes, that's right. Of course, it's a long process. By the way, that also applies to joining the European Union. They keep saying it's going to join the European Union, but there's no way Ukraine is going to join it in the next decade or more. But the thing is, it isn't. I mean, it's symbolic. It won't join NATO. You're absolutely right, technically, but NATO will join Ukraine. In other words, they'll pump in the weapons, and including that dreadful Blinken in January 2022, a month before the war, reneged, and even what Biden had said in his last telephone call with Putin on the 30th of December 2021, said they won't be putting the Mark 41 Aegis ashore with Tomahawk missiles in Ukraine. Blinken in Geneva talking to Lavrov, when Lavrov says, well, let's put this in writing, Blinken said, no, we'll retain the option to put these missiles with about 5 seconds flight time to Moscow in Ukraine. I mean, at that point, you could see the wheels turning in the Kremlin and saying, look, how can you talk to these people? So you're absolutely right. There's no prospect for joining NATO, but it's symbolic. In other words, That's why they talk about demilitarization. We have to make sure, and as you know, John Mearsheimer and everybody says, if they, and even going all the way back to Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, United States, obviously, and quite rightly, is concerned about its own security, as it should be. And so is Russia. Why what is good for the goose should be good for the gander. And yet this double standard seems to apply. But so you're right. It's a good question. Thank you.
So I think we have come to the end of the Q&A and our really illuminating webinar. I want to thank you, Richard, for giving us the time. As I mentioned before, you know, we seem increasingly parochial here in the United States, and talking common sense and remembering history is almost verboten. So I want to thank you. I'm sure that this recording of this webinar will be circulated quite widely. Let me wish you health and wish us all the strength to work for a better future in especially dark times. So thank you again. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you also to Brian Garvey for helping to make this possible.